Welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We're a community of busy research-focused practitioners, BCBAs, just trying to stay on top of all of the current literature in the applied behavior analysis field. My name's Matt. I'm your host. We're going to walk through a journal article today. It's from issue 54, number 4, the fall edition of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. It's called Machine Learning to Analyze Single Case Graphs, a Comparison to Visual Inspection, written by Mark Lanavaz and Kiva Hernchuk from a university in, a university in Canada, which is pretty cool. Remember, this is, of course, brought to you by our library. We curate and select through hundreds of research-centered ABA articles. Learning about any different topic in ABA is just a few clicks away. Come on in and join the community. You can talk to me and we can chat all about current literature, and then you can always provide suggestions to build in more research into the library. So let's hop right into it and talk about the fact that this article is over machine learning for single case design graphs. That's awesome. I just think that's awesome. And I think that's fair to say because topics like this, I don't feel like I really see in science, in psychology in general. You don't typically have programming programs to analyze single case designs. And then the application of machine learning is a really cool application. So while this may not be something where, you're going to go through the methods and try it yourself, I think there are some pretty important takeaways, and really it's just a cool application of our science. So grab a cup of coffee, don't worry about taking notes, and just enjoy this one with me because it was pretty cool to read. So the single case design exists. This method of analysis that we have exists to determine whether a causal relationship is present in between the dependent variable and the independent variable. It's been particularly picked up by our field because of its power in identifying these causal relations in small subject designs. This small subject design is important because our field is so individualized that it's not common for two participants to go through the exact same treatment. Even in the last article, Standish and colleagues in 2021 that we were talking about, they all went through functional communication training. But each participant went through a different style of functional communication training dependent on certain traits as well as identified functions from a trial-based functional analysis. It's not as simple as you take the red pill, you take the blue pill. It's much more granular than that. And the single case design is a really powerful method of seeing those causal effects. Now, I hinted at it at Wednesday's episode, but of course we are going to be talking about how visual inspection is our way of analyzing these single case designs. And this paper echoes Standish and colleagues. Visual inspection is not exactly the most common method, and it's also not exactly the most agreed upon successful method in our field. In fact, a lot of people would point out that visual inspection can get some pretty poor inner rater reliability scores. And that's a serious concern because the vast majority of BCBAs rely on visual inspection every day to make really important decisions in their clinical practice. I know I use visual inspection countless times throughout a day to determine if we're going to keep going with an intervention, pause, change, things like that. At its core, visual inspection is just the analysis of certain variables, analyzing things like the level of the data, the trend, overlap between two different conditions, variability, maybe even immediacy, and multiple other factors. But if you can identify those factors, then maybe a robot can too. And I say that because that's essentially what these authors attempted to do. Identify the different factors that a clinician uses and teach a robot, a machine, a program to do those same things as well. So I kind of teased interrelator reliability before, and that has really had mixed results. You have some studies such as Ford and colleagues 2020, King and colleagues 2010, which have really high agreements. So that's maybe above 80% or even 95 to 100% agreement. But then other more concerning, less than 80% agreements, such as Prospero and Cohen in 1979, Fisher and colleagues in 2003, Wolf et al. In 2016. So there's kind of mixed results in the research. Now, when you dive into those studies, there are definitely some differences in what they considered and ways they analyzed the single case designs. So I think that really going granular into those studies is important if you're really going to make the comment that visual inspection is failing us as a science. But it's important to note that it's not all sunshines and rainbows in visual inspection. So all these studies have looked at inter-rater reliability. So that's when two raters look at the same graph. One says, yes, there's functional control. The other one says, no, there's not functional control. That's scored as a miss, so that's a 0. If they looked at it and said yes and yes, that's a hit. That's 100. Average that out throughout the different numbers of graphs, and that's your reliability. Very simplified, but that's typically the way they do it. However, reliability, remember, doesn't mean accuracy. The example that I always come back to is if you step on your bathroom scale and you weigh the same weight for 3 days, and every time you step on it says 180, then 190, then 170, and your true weight is actually 180, well, that has low reliability. Each time you step on that scale, it gives you a different number. Now, if that scale, each time you step on, measures 170, 170, 170, but you still weigh 180, well, now it's got good reliability. It's giving the same number each time, but that number isn't accurate. The lack of accuracy matters. All of these papers looked at reliability. They didn't look at accuracy. So to solve that problem, it's important to introduce the concept of type 1 error rate and the concept of power. So type 1 error rate is when there is a behavior change, is the identification of behavior change when there is not one. So the researcher says, attention is a moderating variable in a functional analysis when in fact it is not. And power is detecting a change when one does occur. So that same researcher looking at a functional analysis and saying demand is a moderating variable for that problematic behavior when in fact demand is one of those variables. So essentially it's kind of like type 1 and type 2 errors. I'm not sure why they used power instead of type 2 error, and maybe something more statistically significant in that language. Feel free to any of my statistics friends correct me in the comments of the show notes. But what these researchers really wanted to look at was not just the reliability, but the accuracy. And the way they developed to identify and work on the accuracy was a type 1 error rate plus the power. There's been very little research on power in ABA. Rapp and colleagues developed a series of different put out a series of different published articles that looked at type 1 error rates, but didn't report on power. And this is worrisome because a lot of times there's a correlation where low amounts of type 1 errors correlate with low amounts of power. And that kind of makes sense, right? So a type 1 error, remember, is when when the practitioner says there is a behavior change when there is not one. Right. So if you have a low amount of type 1 errors, that means you never get it wrong like that. You never think that there's a behavior change when there's not one. So you're very conservative. But that also probably means that you miss some where there actually are behavior changes, and you miss that. So you have low type 1, but you also have low errors. And that's not a good thing. You want to have low type 1 and high errors. That would be the perfect balance. Notably, Fisher and colleagues in 2003 did compare A and B reliability and created the dual criterion method as visual aid and reported on, Lenovas and colleagues in 2020 reported on power, but Fisher and colleagues in 2003 did compare reliability and then developed the dual criterion method to help practitioners increase their reliability. And Lenovas and colleagues then took the visual criterion method, the dual criterion method, and compared it to 4 kind of proof of concept machine learning tools, machine learning programs. And what they found is that their machine learning programs were able to reliably do better and better than the dual criterion method the more graphs that they consumed, the more learning that took place. And this was better in terms of both low amounts of error rates and high amounts of power. However, those graphs weren't compared to just standard visual inspection. It was only compared to the dual criterion method. So within this paper that we're reading currently, the same authors added in the visual inspection to begin to see what would compare, who would do best, and see if there's any other notable trends. So let's get into the all interesting methods of this paper. They were able to generate via computers 1,024 graphs, and they manipulated 6 different parameters. So the first parameter was they used either 3 or 5 baseline data points. Then they used either 5 or 10 treatment data points. They manipulated the autocorrelation, the trend, the variability, and the effect size in the data. Notably speaking, this was an A-B graph. It wasn't an A-B-A-B. So technically there wasn't any functional control. So when they were doing the surveys, they asked questions like, would there be functional control if this was replicated? So they did kind of solve for that limitation there. And they did that because the dual criterion method was developed for the A-B. So the visual inspectors that they got were 5 individual raters. They all held the BCBAD credential. They all taught in an ABAI verified course sequence. The conservative dual criterion method, the other condition, was the standard one that Fisher and colleagues did in 2003. What that looks like is the baseline, mean, and trend line of the data points was projected from phase A to phase B. So take your baseline, mean, and trend line and just continue that line into phase B. Then raise that line by a quarter standard deviation, and then count how many treatment data points are above that line. If there is 5 treatment data points, then all 5 have to be above that line. If there is 10 points, then 8 have to be above that line. I'm not sure exactly where those values come from. I'm assuming it's from the Fisher paper in 2003. But for our purposes, there was either 5 or 10 treatment data points. And if there was 5, all 5 had to be above. If there was 8, or if there was 10, 8 of the 10 had to be above that line. And finally, for our last competitors in the rink, there was the 2 machine learning models. This was the stochastic gradient descent and the support vector classifier. No, I didn't know what they meant either, and I'm still a little confused, but essentially my understanding is each model examines a different mathematical element in the graph, guesses essentially if it's right, then corrects itself and makes that guess more and more accurate. Sounds a lot like shaping. I can understand shaping. We're basically shaping computer programs, and these computer programs were trained with over 96,000 other computer-generated graphs. This is pretty powerful, right? Going from a click of a button to developing 1,000 graphs to now doing 96,000, and then training your machines on them, making them more and more accurate until you can put them into a research paper. Pretty cool stuff. So those were our 3 competitors. What were the results? So accuracy was highest for the machine learning. So that means that they had the lowest type 1 errors and close to the highest power. Now, there was one visual inspector that beat them out in terms of the highest power, but that's because they had an unacceptably high rate of type 1 errors, which means they were saying everything's a function, which means they got a lot right, but they also got a lot wrong. So they also talk that the rater with the highest type 1 had the highest power, so they were selecting everything, and the person with the lowest type 1 also had the lowest power. And this really illustrates the issue of balance. You don't want to admit it, but each clinician probably has their own way of tacting and labeling important things on a graph. And it becomes almost more like an art than a science when you're dealing with visual inspection. And this really illustrates the issue of balance. You have to find that line between avoiding type 1 errors, but also having a high power rate. And these raters that they chose really struggled to find that line. And I would argue that most BCBAs probably do as well. Machine learning was the condition with the most amount of balance throughout type 1 and power, so low type 1 and high power, which isn't that surprising considering, if these programs work, that would make sense that they'd be more efficient than humans. And then finally, they did find some ancillary things, such as agreement between the raters was moderate at best. That's pretty concerning when you think about the future of visual inspection. And finally, that balancing act was just really tough. So they just gathered a lot of data and evidence on the type 1 power balancing act and the struggles that humans have on making that distinction. Before we get into the final takeaways of this kind of fun Friday article, I think it's important to note that I don't think these authors are telling us not to trust visual inspection as a tool. Visual inspection has got us very far. But I do think these authors are telling us that the value of statistics cannot be ignored in our field. Even though we don't have a traditional setup for statistical analysis, the ability to quantify our data just puts us in so much stronger positions when we go to talk about our data. It's so much easier to say that this is statistically significant versus this looks good, right? Doesn't that just feel better to say, like, mathematically I'm correct versus, yeah, I've been doing this for a while, so I'm probably correct. So I think that the use of aids to help the analysis is important. Training better could increase that reliability and accuracy. But I also think just including more and more statistical analysis to our data, it can do nothing but improve our chances of avoiding type 1 errors and increasing our power scores. So key takeaways for me: do you trust your visual analysis? Do you even use visual analysis as a clinician? You should be at least using visual analysis, but this might be a good call to maybe introduce some statistics. Dowdy and colleagues in 2021 had a great summary of clinical practical statistics that you can use to help quantify some of your data. And I would encourage you to reread that and dive in and just pick a couple and really go all in and say, this is what I'm going to use to analyze my data. And just that little bit of statistics may really help your decision making. My only really consideration is this is really cool, and I'm excited to see this extent of technology being pushed into our field. I mean, I'm a podcaster. I'm talking about applied behavior analysis. Like, it's a really cool time to be in our field. I think we're going to see a lot of explosive growth. I'm very optimistic, and I love seeing these types of articles being written by, I don't know if they're programmers first and behavior analysts second or vice versa, but it's really cool to see. Anyways, guys, that will close out a week for the Behaviorist Book Club. Thank you so much for tuning in each and every day. I'm committed to bringing you current ABA literature and topics every single time an article comes out. Remember, you can always get more and more information and save more and more time by going to the library and logging in, becoming a member, joining the club, and getting access to peer-reviewed articles as well as different behavior change techniques, whether it be problem behavior or verbal behavior and everything in between, even some PFA and ISCA content in there as well for just $20 a month. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday.